From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning. Well, thank you all for being here. It's such a great crowd here so early in the morning on a holiday weekend. So my name is Tim Collins, and I work for Wells Fargo. And we've been a sponsor of the book festival now for the last 5 years. So I'm just going to make a couple of brief remarks until we get on, and then let you guys get on to the good stuff here. But wanted to tell you why we're involved with the book festival. Yes, we are a very large financial institution, but we like to think of ourselves as a community bank, and we are really involved with the communities that we serve, both nationally and locally. We volunteer, lots of our team members volunteer, we donate, we're on community boards, and so when we looked at the book festival, it's such a great opportunity and such a community event on both the local level here in the DC area and certainly representing the national community as well. And the second reason was we are really involved in education. We have a program, I'll give you an example, a program called Reading First, which involves our team members partnering with schools at the preschool, K, first and second grade level, and go in and give kids books and read to them aloud in the schools. And what we find is that when kids own their first book, their interest in reading really takes a quantum leap. So it's a great program. We have donated more than 1 million books and have team members volunteering almost 2 million hours of volunteer time with people in programs like that. So enough about that. I just want to tell you some things that we're doing today that are kind of fun and contributing to the event. There's a stagecoach outside where we have a long history going back to the stagecoach, which predates the Transcontinental Railroad, which Ms. Roberts is going to talk a little bit about in her book. And we have a stagecoach out here. We have a stagecoach downstairs in Hall B. And then we also have a lot of other fun activities. We have a reading program, our Reading First program going on, where we are going to actually give kids books. And so we'll be reading aloud in English, Spanish, and American Sign Language. And those kids that participate in that event will also have the opportunity to get a Wells Fargo plush pony as well. And then we're also going to be doing our Together experience, which is a virtual reality experience. It's really cool. It may not be your thing, but it's worthwhile to at least go by and check it out because it's a pretty fun experience. So with that, I am going to turn it over to John Haskell from the Library of Congress to introduce Cokie. Thank you and have a great day.
Good morning. I work at the Congressional Research Service, which probably a lot of you know about, and heading one of the research divisions. I was not given the toughest assignment at the festival to introduce Cokie Roberts. It's mostly telling you things you already know, so I'll say a few of those things. She's currently the senior news analyst, or one of the senior news analysts at NPR. Among her many distinctions, she has 3 Emmy Awards. Cokie also received the Living Legend Award from the Library of Congress. She's the author of several books, most recently, Capital Dames, The Civil War, and The Women of Washington. By the way, she'll be signing that directly after this event. She'll have to rush down to the lower level, the book sales shop. So you'll have to make way for her to get down there when she's done. I'm going to add one personal thing from those of us who spent much of their lives in the heartland of the country in the pre-internet era. Many of us relied on Cokie, whether it was NPR or ABC TV, as a unique source, and I mean unique, of reasoned and balanced analysis on the politics and issues of the day, and she continues to provide that service. But speaking for me and many, many other people, we're very grateful that she did that service for us and continues to do that service. Please help me welcome Cokie Roberts. Thanks, Cokie.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here on this Labor Day weekend. I think this book festival is one of the greatest things that happens year in and year out. Hundreds of thousands of people showing up to celebrate books and to buy them. What a concept. and children and families. Usually my grandchildren are with me, but I'm going to catch a plane and go see them in a minute. But it is a wonderful event, and the fact is that I write these history books. Often, many of the characters in my history books are political wives. And it was a political wife who started this book festival. It was Laura Bush, who went to the fabulous Librarian of Congress, Jim Billington, and said, I did a Texas book festival. Can we do one in Washington? And it shows you what a fabulous legacy political wives throughout our history have left here in Washington. So that makes it even more delightful for me to be able to participate in it. And also, by the way, we should just say that the volunteers at this festival are the heroes, because by and large, the sheroes, because there's no way that this could go on without these wonderful hundreds of volunteers. So thank you all very much for what you do. I had written other history books about women in history, and I never was going to write about the Civil War. First of all of my ancestors fought on the losing side. And so I didn't really have any interest in it. And secondly, it's an awful war. It's a horrible, horrible time in our history where we lost more than 600,000 Americans. And it's a failure of the political system that these politicians could not get to emancipation without war. And as somebody who covers politics and cares about politics, that to me was so dispiriting that I really did not want to write about it. But my publisher had other ideas, and was pretty clear that I was writing a book about the Civil War. So I started to think about that, but I actually had absolutely no idea what that book was going to be. I knew it would be about women. There are plenty of the others. People always say to me, why do you write about women? Huh? I mean, it seems fairly obvious to me, but aside from the fact that I'm in a skirt, I do think that the other half of humankind should have books written about them. But and I would actually argue that history is not accurate without knowing what the rest of the world was up to. But so I knew it was about women, and I knew that I would make great discoveries. I knew that I would find wonderful women's letters that would just delight me. I have to say, the men's letters, particularly in the founding period, but throughout our history, are so studied and edited and ready for publication that they read as though they were written by those bronze and marble statues, right? Whereas the women's letters are just letters. They're funny and they're frank and they're truthful. There's a concept, and they'll tell you the whole story. In the same letter, you'll read about, well, maybe we should go to war with France, but I need my new hat that I left at home, and so-and-so's having babies and all too often losing them, and here's what the economic situation is. You get the full picture of society and life through women's letters. And you find them, because most of them have never been published, and you find these utterly delightful things. My favorite still remains one from my second history book, Ladies of Liberty, about the early republic, and it was written by Louisa Catherine Adams, John Quincy Adams' wife. And it was written when he was Secretary of State, and she was running his campaign for president. She called it her vocation to get him elected president. And she wrote these wonderful gossipy letters home from Washington to John Adams. Abigail had died. Here's Abigail, by the way. And she had died, and John was lonely. And so Louisa wrote these letters home. And this particular letter was from the year 1820. And it was the year of the Missouri Compromise. And so because of the hammering out the compromise, Congress stayed in session much longer than usual. And so finally they go home. And in July, Louisa goes to a meeting of the trustees of the orphan asylum that Dolly Madison had established after the British invasion in 1814. And she gets there, and one of the other trustees says to her, well, we're going to need a new building. And Louisa says, why? What do we need a new building for? And the woman says, I'm quoting, the session had been very long. The fathers of the nation had left 40 cases to be provided for by the public, and our institution was the most likely to be called upon to maintain this illicit progeny. Congress had left 40 pregnant women behind, and there were only like 187 members of Congress. And I mean, some of them might have been recidivist, I don't know, but and so she was up in arms, and she says, I recommended a petition to Congress next session for that great and moral body to establish a founding institution, and should certainly move that the $2 additional a day, which they have been given themselves as an increase in pay, may be appropriated as a fund toward the support of the institution. It doesn't get any better than that. I mean, it's just, when I found that letter, I was in ecstasy. And then it did turn out that one of the great letter writers that I found for this book, the Civil War book, was her daughter-in-law, Abigail Brooks Adams, who was married to Charles Francis Adams, and she came to Washington when he was briefly in Congress before he went off to be the Union ambassador to the Court of St. James through the war. And she wrote these wonderful, feisty letters home, you know, calling President Buchanan a heavy old toad, and, you know, and saying, you know, the Senate behaved like children, and silly ones at that. I could get behind that one. And but then my personal favorite, again, was, I would advise any young woman who wishes to have an easy, quiet life not to marry an Adams. So I knew that the letters, whatever I found, would be wonderful, but I still didn't know what the book was. And so I started thinking about my own growing up here in Washington after World War II. And at that point, the mall was covered with what were called temporary buildings. I actually remember as a very little girl asking my mother what temporary meant, because the buildings didn't seem to be going anywhere. And they were basically Quonset huts. They were very ugly. They've since been replaced by those ugly buildings on Independence Avenue. But they were a physical manifestation of how the war had increased the role of government. It actually started with World War I, then World War II, and how it had made Washington's place in the country a very different place than it had been at the beginning of the century. I also, of course, knew the stories of Rosie the Riveter and the government girls coming to Washington during the war. And I knew that the role of women during the war had promoted women's rights after the war. The Republicans had put the ERA in their platform in 1940, but it took the war to get the Democrats to do it in 1944, and then the movement towards equal rights, again, coming out of the experiences of the war. So I started wondering, well, maybe that's it. Maybe the Civil War had a similar impact on women's lives and on the role of Washington in society, in the country. And so I started researching that, and I turned out that yes, in fact, that was exactly the case. And so that's the book. And it was just fascinating to learn about it, because it's as much a history of Washington in the period as it is a history of the women. And as somebody who's lived here all of my life, in addition to Louisiana, it was of great interest to me. And some of these women are women that you know of, like Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix, but you probably don't know all about them, and some of the things that they did were absolutely remarkable. Clara Barton had come here to work in the government. She worked in the patent office, and she actually made as much as men for a period of time. But then during the war, government girls did show up in the same way that they did in World War II. Mainly, it was women coming to make a living with their husbands or the men in their lives gone. But then it coincided with Congress passing the bill to allow the printing of greenbacks to finance the war. And then, as now, the money comes off the printing presses in great, huge sheets of bills. It's a lot of fun to watch if you've never seen it go. But now, of course, it's all cut up into individual bills by machine. Then it took women sitting there with scissors, cutting out bill by bill by bill. And the Treasurer of the United States, General Skinner, said, women are just better with scissors than men are. He also allowed us how he could pay them less, which was something that many of us experienced in our own lives. But, and then Rosie the Riveter, the equivalent, in my view, of the women who worked in the arsenals, which they did around the country. But here in Washington, it was mainly very young and very poor women who worked in the arsenal. And there was this horrendous arsenal explosion that killed a couple of dozen of these girls. And the day after, the story was just awful to read, of them pulling the tarp off of the charred bodies, and they were really basically unrecognizable. And the reporter said, they were trapped in their hoop skirts. And you could see these 19th century, mid-century women working in this very dangerous job in this broiling hot arsenal and being proper in their hoop skirts. Thousands of people showed up for the funeral, led by the President and the Secretary of War, and formed a procession going to the Congressional Cemetery, where there is a monument to them, recognizing their tremendous contribution to the war effort. And as I say, then there were women that you do know about, like Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix. There were also women journalists who came to town. Again, some of them came before the war. One of them was Jane Swisshelm, who was somewhat the fiercest of among them. She was an abolitionist and a suffragist. And she was the first woman allowed to write from the Senate press gallery. But she was soon kicked out of the Senate press gallery for writing vicious truths, which was, she wrote that Daniel Webster was a drunk, and the men didn't like that. And again, it reminded me a lot of my own experiences. But there were activists, there were orators, there were all these fascinating women who thrived during the war in Washington, and the reporters came in large numbers. Dorothea Dix was here before the war lobbying in Congress, and she was so influential that she was actually given a little alcove in the Senate library by the Senate from which to do her lobbying. And while she was here, she established St. Elizabeth's. And then she went off to other places when she failed at the bill she was trying to get through Congress. It was vetoed by President Pierce. But she then came back for the war and brought herself into the Surgeon General and said that she would be the superintendent of female nurses. There were no female nurses. She created that and opened the profession to women. It really had not been women's work to be nurses, with the exception of Catholic nuns. And she was a formidable figure. The whole medical profession, of course, was closed to women. There were just a couple of female doctors in the country at the time. One of them was a surgeon, Mary Walker, who again came to Washington and presented herself to work for the Union Army. She was not hired. She worked as a volunteer. And then in the course of her work during the war, she was eventually hired. She was captured. She had such horrific experiences that she is still the only woman to have won the Medal of Honor. was Mary Walker during the Civil War. By the time Dorothea Dix died, by the way, she had created more than 100 mental hospitals around the world, including in Japan, meaning she had to travel by herself there. Clara Barton, what you probably know about Clara Barton, this is what drives me completely nuts about history books, particularly textbooks, is, Clara Barton founded the American Red Cross. Really? Was it hard? Did anything go before that? How about, what was involved there? Well, of course, a great deal was involved. She, as I say, came as a government worker, then did heroic work during the war as a nurse and a supplier, and then went to Europe after the war and discovered the Red Cross and came back and lobbied for 2 decades to get the Geneva Conventions ratified by the Senate. And when they finally did ratify them, it was with the American Amendment, which she wrote, which says that the Red Cross could go to natural disasters as well as to war zones. So anytime you see the Red Cross in after a flood or a hurricane or an earthquake anywhere in the world, it's because Clara Barton, when she then went back to Geneva as the American representative, got the American Amendment adopted by the International Red Cross. So there was a lot involved in founding the American Red Cross. But I, of course, was most interested, because I'm me, in the political women. And I got to know a lot of them very well, and I liked a lot of them a lot. One who I really very much enjoyed getting to know was Verena Davis, Jefferson Davis's wife. Him not so much, but she was here as the wife of him, as a senator and a cabinet officer. And all the women of Washington, after Dolly Madison died, which was not until 1849, really were vying to be the chief belle. And they described themselves as belles. One of them, who I write about, wrote a book about herself called A Belle of the 50s. And so they all knew each other. They basically all liked each other, even though they vied. And one of the women who they all liked enormously was Adele Cutts, who was Dolly Madison's great niece. And then she married Stephen Douglas, the senator who, of course, defeated Abraham Lincoln in the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. And Verena Davis was furious that this was happening. And she wrote to her mother, and this is why women's letters are so wonderful. She says, "The dirty speculator and party trickster, broken in health by drink, with his first wife's money, buys an elegant, well-bred woman because she is poor and her father is proud." But then Verena says it's a good thing there's a new water system coming to Washington, so that sparing his wife's olfactories, Douglas may wash a little oftener. If he don't, his acquaintance will build larger rooms with more perfect ventilation. Now, you don't learn from the men that Stephen Douglas stinks. So it's great. She, when she did go off to Richmond to be the First Lady of the Confederacy, much to her dismay, she stayed in close touch with her friends here, particularly Elizabeth Blair Lee of Blair House, and Lizzie Lee wrote wonderful, wonderful letters. Her brother, Montgomery Blair, was in the cabinet. Her other brother, Frank Blair, was in the Congress. Her father, Francis Preston Blair, was, of course, a big advisor to Lincoln. But her husband, Samuel Phillips Lee, who was a cousin of Robert E. Lee, was in the Union Navy. And because he was in the Navy, she wrote to him almost every day. And we have her letters. The wartime letters are published. The rest are at Princeton. And they are just utterly delightful letters. And she and Verena stayed in touch through the war. She was also one of the few people who befriended Mary Lincoln. Not easy to do. And Mary Lincoln came to town at a tough time. It was basically a southern town. They didn't like Abraham Lincoln, and they thought she was, women here thought she was kind of a rough Westerner, which was not fair, but that was the assessment. She then made life harder for herself by being a difficult person. And at one point, she was accused of leaking the president's State of the Union message. And there was a congressional investigation of the First Lady's private communications. She had a personal servant, too. It was the servants, carried the letters back and forth. And she was accused of leaking it to the New York Herald, either in exchange for favorable publicity or in exchange for money or because she was having an affair, depending on the rumor of the moment. But she was not a well-liked person. And after the president was shot, the only person she really had become friendly with was Elizabeth Keckley, her dressmaker, who was really much more than a dressmaker. She was an artist. She was a couturier. She was written about as a great personage. And Mary Lincoln's in the White House for a couple of months, just in crazy, out of her mind, after the president shot. And Mrs. Keckley is there with her. She then takes her back to Chicago, all of that. And then Elizabeth Keckley wrote a tell-all book. I mean, nothing changes. And it ended her relationship with Mrs. Lincoln, and it actually ended her business, too, because others were worried she might write similar books. But she was then able to do what she was very interested in, which was basically social work. When enslaved people started showing up in Washington trying to free themselves before emancipation and then after emancipation, she was a former slave herself, and she saw the terrible circumstances. And so she started what was called the Contraband Relief Association, which became Freedmen's Relief Association. And she was very involved in getting people to help these desperately poor people, because she did have the contacts and was able to raise the money. And that was what you started to see, was that the people who had been behind the scenes or had been doing other things were now coming forward as the war ended. And so Virginia Clay, who had been the wife of an Alabama senator and a delightful flirt in the pre-war period, she's the one who wrote the book about herself, A Belle of the 50s, became a great suffragist and was suddenly on platforms after the war with Horace Greeley and Mrs. William Lloyd Garrison, people that had fought her husband bitterly in the period leading up to the war and during the war. But she had, because of her experiences during the war, felt that she could come forward and be someone herself and use her own voice to promote a cause that had not occurred to her before the war. Verena Davis, after Jefferson Davis died, long drawn out, difficult situation where he'd been in jail, accused of being one of the Lincoln conspirators. She worked to get him out of jail. That's another thing. These women showed up in the White House all the time. They'd just go marching into the White House and tell off the president, whomever he was. I mean, I am so jealous, I can't tell you. It is, Andrew Johnson let Virginia Clay's husband out of jail just to make her go away, and it is quite remarkable. But at any rate, Verena Davis got Jefferson Davis out of jail too, which didn't work so well for her. But she then, he finally died, and she decided to move to New York to be a reporter. Now, mainly she wanted the money. She had to make a living, but also she wanted the freedom. And there was a big scandal that the First Lady of the Confederacy was moving to New York. And she had always been a little bit too olive-complected for a perfect Southern belle. And so she wrote to her daughter and said, "I am free, brown, and 62. I'm going to move wherever I wanted to." And so while she was in New York, she befriended Julia Grant. And it was page one in every newspaper in the country. Which is another great thing now. You can get these newspapers online. The Library of Congress has a wonderful site, Chronicling America. And there they were. And what they knew they were doing was bringing about reconciliation. And that's what a lot of these women were involved in their own voices after the war was over. And so you see the tremendous impact that it had on their lives and on the role of women in America going forward. And in fact, Clara Barton said at a Memorial Day, again, something established by the women to try to bring about reconciliation, the Memorial Day celebrations, she said at one of her addresses at a Memorial Day celebration in the 1880s, she said, because of the war, woman was at least 50 years in advance of the normal position which continued peace would have assured her. So that's these women. These are the Capitol dames. They were remarkable people. I loved getting to know them. I know you will too. Thank you very, very much for being here, and I'd be delighted to take your questions. Thank you. So there are microphones at the front of each aisle, and the folks here would very much appreciate it if you'd come to the microphones because they are taping this, or whatever one does these days, digitizing, whatever. So, yeah.
Good morning, and thank you so much for these wonderful remarks.
Thank you for coming.
I am fascinated by Dorothea Dix's lobbying career because I've looked at the scholarship, and at that point in time, that would be a very public and non-traditional role for women. And in fact, a Los Angeles Times article from 1875 said women as lobbyists could not work the halls of Congress without taint. And so I'm just so fascinated. Can you share any more with us about Dorothea Dix or women lobbyists?
Well, she could do it without taint because she was already so well known by the time she showed up in Washington. The bill that she was trying to get through was to put aside millions of acres of federal land for the impoverished and the mentally ill. And she'd get it through one House of Congress one year, another House of Congress another year. She finally did get it through both houses of Congress, and President Pierce said that this was it was up to the states to support the impoverished. And so he vetoed it. But she was immune from the normal things. But the taint that you're talking about was definitely there, and I do write about it. Women lobbyists were considered maybe exchanging some favors for the votes. And there was some of that with women government workers too, that because to get the job, this is one of the reasons the civil service was created, because to get the job, a congressman had to recommend them, and sometimes he would demand something in return. And so it always had a little whiff about it. And but they still did them. They still did those jobs, and there were lots of women lobbyists after the war. So, thank you. Yes.
Good morning.
Hi.
Who would you put on the $10 or $20
Oh, I know.
bill?
I have a really hard time with this, and part of the reason for it is that the women just didn't have the same kind of power as a Benjamin Franklin or a Abraham Lincoln. But I can make a good case for Clara Barton. She's not somebody you'd want to hang with, frankly. She was very worthy. But an earthquake hits Nepal, and the Red Cross is there, and that's all because of her. And that's true this many years later. So I can make that case.
I don't mean to change the subject too much, but I sort books for a inner city library that we used to then fundraise. And I came across a book that I actually paid 50 cents for, Our Haggadah.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So in 2 generations of my family, I now have 3 major religions. Can you
It's
tell
America,
me?
America.
Yes. Is there a happy ending?
No, well, we're still married. It'll be 49 years this week. But Our Haggadah was a book that the Passover Seder that Steve and I have hosted, and I've cooked at our house for the last 47 years, and it is a Haggadah written for interfaith marriages. Yeah.
Good morning.
Hi.
I have enjoyed all 3 of your books on
you.
women's history.
Thank you.
And I was wondering if you were going to continue the journey up.
Yes, I don't know how necessarily. People keep saying to me, "What's your next project?" And this book almost killed me. I keep saying it's like saying, "Mrs. Roberts, you just had triplets. When's the next baby coming?" And so I'm not exactly sure what the next project is. I have things rattling around here, but the immediate one is, so I was here last year at the festival with the children's book of Founding Mothers, which is this wonderfully, wonderfully illustrated book, illustrated by Diane Good, who's a Caldecott Medal winner, and it's a beautiful book. And so we're doing the sequel to that, The Ladies of Liberty for Children. And so that's the next project, and that one I can handle.
Good morning.
Hi.
It's good to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you for coming.
Many years I have admired you.
Thank you.
My question is, did Clara Barton have any connection with the free slaves?
I don't have, she was an abolitionist.
Especially women.
She was an abolitionist, but I don't have letters of hers along those lines, and it didn't seem to be a major issue with her.
It is a major issue.
Well, to her, I'm saying. But there were quite a few women who did. There was a woman named Josephine Giddings.
I'm talking about Clara Barton.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Okay, she was an abolitionist, and it was a cause that she was concerned about, but it wasn't her major occupation. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hello, thank you for speaking. I wondered how you got access to all these letters. Was that difficult?
Well, right here we have Laura from the Manuscript Division of the Library of Congress. Then that's a good place to go. So when I did Founding Mothers, it was much harder for a couple of reasons. First of all, we were dealing in the 18th century, not the 19th, but also a lot of people felt that I was a mere journalist, and what was I doing rooting around in history? I was supposed to deal with today. And so people were not as forthcoming as they became after that book came out. And once I published Founding Mothers and people sort of saw what I was up to, I started getting a lot more help from historical societies, university libraries, and historic homes. And the Library of Congress was always helpful. But so those are the main places you go. What's happened with modern technology is that a helpful soul, will scan a lot of the letters and send them to you, so you don't have to travel and go through it that way. Even once I get them, and that's for a fee, which is fair enough, Once I get them, though, what I have then is scanned 19th century handwritten letters that are written this way and this way because everybody was saving paper, and I can't read them very well. So I had to hire somebody to help me read them because they required deciphering. But that's kind of a treat in itself, because then you're coming upon unexpected things. And for instance, with Virginia Clay Clopton, which was her second husband's name, the woman who wrote The Belle of the 50s, it's kind of a cheery, funny, flirtatious book. She wrote a diary about the same period, which is far starker, and it had not been published. No. And I got that from Duke University Library, the David Rubenstein Library at Duke University. Hi.
World is not meant for people who are 5'2". Coming closer to sort of your parents' and my parents' generation, is there a way to handle Korea and World War II, given that the letters are so many, so all over the world? Because we're losing the history of the war at home.
Yeah, well, there have been some good World War II women's letters, books written. We Were in This War Too is one of them. And there's a book about the women air service pilots, the WASP. again, from their own families. But, I really don't want to write about the 20th century. I lived through most of it, and or at least more than half of it, and I kind of like dead people, long dead people, and although even they can be a problem. I was talking to some group about founding mothers, and I got some descendant of someone all outraged, and saying that I had portrayed her ancestor in an unsavory light. And, I said, give it a rest, It's been several hundred years now, and she was actually a delightful woman, but she was a little bit of a tramp, and But so there you are,
Good morning. Thank you so much for speaking. I was interested in your comment that you never had any intention about writing about the Civil War, being a Southerner and having that affiliation. How has going through this process changed that for you, or has it? And how you kind of associate or preconceptions that you had of being a Southerner?
No, I'm a Southerner. But I must say that since I wrote this book, all of a sudden my Southern Confederate Army ancestors are coming out of the woodwork, and one of their uniforms showed up, and so the and I can deal with those people. The fact is that I love growing up in the South, and I have a tremendous sense of being at home in the South. But I also know all of the problems, and would never in a million years try to pretend that they did not exist. I grew up as the child of a civil rights supporter from the Deep South in the 1960s, and it was a cross was burned on our lawn. It was a very tumultuous time, and so I would never in a million years say that it was not as violent and as wrong-headed and as immoral as it was. The war itself, as I said at the beginning, to me, aside from the fact that it was such a horrendous loss of life, and of course the people who lost the most were in the South. The area was ravaged for decades to come. But the fact is that it was such a failure of the ability of politicians to do what they're supposed to do, which is to bring the country together. And it's a true object lesson of where we don't want to be in politics, of people not able to come together and do the right thing for the good of the country. And that's something worth learning over and over and over again. I think, all right, there's a hook over here. It's a very subtle hook. It says, wrap up. So I will wrap up. I'm very, very grateful to all of you for coming. I'm going immediately downstairs to sign this book. I really hope that you do read it, because you will love getting to know these women. And I do think it's important that we do know all of our history, the history of our women. Thank you so much for that.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.